Hello, everybody. Today's guest is Dr. Janelle Aijian. She's a philosopher and the Associate Director of the Torrey Honors College at Biola University. Do you ever find yourself doubting what you believe? Well, today, Dr. Aijian will talk about what doubt is, whether it's healthy, and how to know if you're using it well or just as a defense mechanism. Please welcome to the show, Dr. Janelle Aijian. Dr. Aijian, thanks for taking the time to talk today.
Thanks for having me. It's great to be here.
So, in your article, Doubting 101, you delve into the two types of doubt as discussed by Karl Barth, which are intellectual and existential. Can you dig more into what those are and what you mean by that? And are they healthy? Are they unhealthy? And how so?
Yeah, sure. So that's a distinction that I actually had discovered experientially before I knew that Karl Barth had ever described it. That was something that I first encountered doing office hours with students and in my own life. And basically, the thing that I would say is a lot of times a student would come into my office and they would have a problem that was sort of felt like an intellectual problem, something like, okay, explain to me how an all-powerful God could allow evils to happen in the world. And so the problem was framed as intellectual. But I started discovering as I engaged with students who had these sorts of questions that, man, over and over again, once we got into, okay, well, where did this problem sort of start for you? Where did this particular concern emerge? That for most of my students, the initial breach had actually been experiential and relational. Something had happened to somebody they loved, and so they had taken that relational experience of sort of a breach in their sort of feeling like God can be trusted, and then found an intellectual sort of argument to overlay on top of that. I think mostly because it would just make them feel better about bringing it forward, about entertaining it. It felt like it was more legitimate, I think, to them to sort of cast it in intellectual terms as opposed to just admitting that really, like, for the most part, the thing that was going on with them was personal. This was a question of like, look, I trusted you and you didn't come through. How can I trust you again, with respect to God? And so the longer I did that with office hours, the more I started to realize that it didn't do a lot of good to just address the question on the intellectual level. The first thing I needed to know is what happened. Why is this troubling to you? And then we could start talking about. I mean, there are good intellectual answers to the intellectual questions. It just turns out that if your question isn't actually intellectual, the intellectual answers don't help, right? The
Yeah.
intellectual answers are if they're just a cover for something that goes a lot deeper. It's just way more helpful to address the deeper thing.
Mm. Yeah. Do you think, though, that sometimes personal experiences can uncover intellectual truths that, because of an experience, it might raise a legitimate intellectual doubt?
Yeah. Yeah, I think I wonder if sometimes what's happened is the story that someone has been believing about God and the way that God works in the world turns out not to be true, right? Maybe they had sort of believed even tacitly like a prosperity gospel or some sort of a kind of a more pagan model that would say like, okay, if you do X, Y, or Z, God then owes you X, Y, or Z, sort of a kind of exchange model. I would call that as more
Mm.
of a pagan model. And maybe that was the way that they were taught, or maybe that wasn't the way that they were taught explicitly, but somehow implicitly that was what they picked up. And then they get into life, and it turns out that that doesn't work, right? It turns out that here I am. I did the things I ought to be experiencing, health, wealth, and prosperity from God, and lo, I'm not. Um, I do think that in moments like that, the experience does actually give you insight. Oh, maybe I've been misunderstanding, right? Like maybe the thing that I have believed to be the promise of Christianity about how God will relate to his faithful people needs to be more nuanced. And so yeah, I do think that there can be, yeah, those experiential uh, sort of breaches force us into understanding with a lot more complexity the way that God relates to us. Yeah. So I think I would say the answer to that question is definitely yes in some cases. I
Mm,
also think in other cases the intellectual thing is just a smokescreen. It's just a way of protecting myself from having to deal with the thing that's really going on.
hmm. So, if a person is experiencing doubt of some variety, how can they start parsing out whether it's a healthy doubt to have or whether it's proving just unhelpful?
Yeah. I mean, I would say I don't know that I would cast doubt into sort of healthy or unhealthy.
Mm,
'Cause I don't necessarily think that doubt is something that you have a lot of control over if you're experiencing it. I might ask about like so sometimes the thing that's causing the doubt is actually an unhealthy behavior. So for instance, and this is just a sort of a hard truth, but man, I've seen it experientially so much. If you've got an addiction to pornography or if you've got some sort of settled sin in your life, one of the ways that that will express itself over time is in a crisis of faith. That's just
mm,
like it's a weirdly sort of predictable correlation between those two things. And so if your doubt is rooted in sin, then kind of by definition that's unhealthy. But I would say for the most part, especially for 18 to 22-year olds, look, you're in a process, a natural, healthy process of separating from your family of origin, from the church that you grew up in, from the school that you grew up in, right? You sort of you oftentimes Biola students believe in God and believe in the truth of the gospel in large part because of the context that they grew up in. That's not true for everyone. For a
sure.
lot of Biola students, that's the case, right? Is like I am a Christian at least in part because I'm an Aijian or because I know, yeah, I grew up in the church and the school that I grew up in. And so the process that 18 to 22-year-olds just naturally experience as they separate from their family of origin and from their kind of original context is a process where they start saying like, "Oh, hey, that was weird, right?" Like I kind of like I realized that the way that we celebrated people's birthdays was kind of crazy now that I have compared that to other people's celebrations of birthdays. Huh. Maybe I won't do that with my kids, right? Like
Mm,
maybe that was just a little bit off. You're doing that all over the map, all kinds of different elements of your life, that your life as you were growing up. And one of the things that is going to happen I almost all the time is that one of the pieces that's going to be on the table during this 18 to 22-year-old phase is, well, my parents were believers. Like, do I want to follow them in that? And if I do I want to follow them in the tradition that they were a part of? Do I want to like the liturgy or the specific church denomination or things like that? I realize in my young adult life that that belief is in a lot of ways founded on custom and kind of like family loyalty. And I realize that that's not an appropriate foundation for that to have anymore now that I'm getting into my adult life. If I'm going to have a Christian belief, it's going to need to be on a different foundation than that. And so if that's the case, then there's going to be doubt in the course of that process, right? Like as you're trying to figure out, okay, where do I stand? Where am I going to plant my flag? And for what reasons? It's a little bit like, I mean, the beginning of Descartes' meditations, where he's kind of looking at his life and thinking like, oh man, I've believed all kinds of things because people told me to. I now realize that some of the things that people told me to believe are false. So what am I going to do about that, right? Like, how do
mm.
I start now sorting through the false beliefs and the true and figuring out what I really want to hold myself to? And
Mm,
it's a complicated process. It's a process that involves your heart as much as your brain. It's a process that takes time and that's going to mostly solidify as your life solidifies over the next 10 or so years, as you start living into a set of beliefs and priorities and values that ultimately will become clear even to you more in retrospect as you realize what you've been consistently choosing over time, as opposed to it being something that you sort of go in knowing that you're going to choose, right? There's a kind of it's choice and self-discovery happening simultaneously that's going to eventually land you where you're going to land in terms of your convictions and your values and your beliefs. And there are ways that you can impact that as it's happening. But I would say doubt in that phase of life, I think is like inevitable. And the question about health and unhealth isn't so much whether or not you doubt, but how you respond, and your willingness to kind of live into that response in community with grace through prayer, things like that.
yeah. So you brought up Descartes, and Descartes famously said that like doubt is the origin of wisdom, which seems to paint doubt in a very positive light. Um, uh, do you feel like that's true? I mean, since it is inevitable, do you feel like doubt is the origin of wisdom? And if so, how? How does that actually functionally work?
Yeah, so I'm not going to go all the way with Descartes because Descartes really optimistic about what doubt can accomplish, right? He's going to say all you have to do is doubt, and then this is a caricature, but it's close. All you have to do is doubt, and then you'll find yourself with these certain foundations that you can build everything else on. And then at the end of the day, the question we'll be asking isn't what can I know, but how is it possible that I ever make an error? Because here I am at the end of this beautiful journey into perfect certitude. Um, I don't think that's how it works. Um, I I tend to play more for Team Pascal, and Pascal's got a more nuanced sort of approach where he's going to be talking about the reality that as human beings, we just aren't going to get the kind of certainty that we want out of this life, right? There's a bug in the machine, and that bug is original sin, and it's going to mean that no matter how hard we try, we're always going to desire a level of certainty that is not going to be accessible to us on this in this life. Which is not to say that there's no hope, because I think the other thing that you can do with doubt is it can just be this corroding, acidic sort of thing that you can dump onto all of your beliefs, all of your values, and you can tell yourself, oh, what I'm doing here is I'm like stripping away all of the falsehoods and getting to the thing itself. But actually what you might end up doing is just ending up with nothing at all. C.S. Lewis wrote a really interesting book just after he became a Christian, that's called Pilgrim's Regress. And one of the it's a kind of a he maps the terrain of different ideologies onto like a geographical map, and his pilgrim kind of goes north and south on this journey, and he ends up at one point trapped by a giant who tortures him through seeing through everything. And he's sort of stuck in this X-ray vision of just constantly seeing through everything. And that if I can see through everything, then it turns out that I'm not seeing to reality. I'm actually just seeing nothing, right? Like if I it's great to be able to see through the wall so that you can see the thing that's on the other side of the wall. But if you can see through that too, eventually you're just in a blank. There's just nothing to see anymore. And I think that there's a way that a kind of an unrestrained doubt, and I would even call it a hubristic doubt, could sort of strip away all of the things that we actually do have imperfect but fairly good reasons to believe. Um, so one of the responses that you might get to something like that, sort of, hey, doubt, awesome, uh, mode, is something like what Thomas Reed does, and what he does is he appeals to kind of common sense notions And he says, look, these common sense notions that we all agree to are fine. You don't have to doubt them. You can kind of begin from those, and the sort of the strong, deep skepticism isn't helpful or necessary. Um, I initially, when I started doing this journey, was really excited about Reed, and just to be honest, I actually eventually decided I didn't love that approach quite as much as Pascal's approach,
Hmm.
which is to say, okay, all of these things we believe to be true, but we can't justify in the way that we know we need to or that we want to. What do we do with them? Uh, De- Descartes wants to say, I can justify them rationally. I can prove that these things are true, and then I can feel certainty in them. Pascal says, no, I think if those are true, they're true because the good God who made me gave them to me. And I think if I begin my intellectual life with trust that the person who made me with these kind of indelible sort of assumptions or beliefs inside of me, and by the way, we're talking about things like time moves linearly forward and space has three dimensions, right? They're not,
Hmm.
the law of non-contradiction. These are very basic things
Hmm.
that we use and that we just can't justify because you need them to justify everything else, right? Pascal says those things are grace, and that your intellectual life, if it's going to move beyond just acidic skepticism, is going to have to begin with some trust that the maker who gave you those intuitions made the world and fitted your ability to perceive to the world that he created. And once you've got that as a premise, you can actually get going and get a fair ways in your intellectual life. But to say, oh no, I can do that work on my own, and I don't need to begin with a posture of trust and grace. Pascal thinks is a blind alley, and I'm inclined to agree with him about that.
Hmm. Thank you. That's it. That's really interesting. That's very helpful. Um. Okay. So then, to talk a little bit more about um, when you're in the position where you have doubt and then need to start parsing through that, it seems to me that there are like two obvious avenues to pursue. The one is to say, in this case, like, I have doubts about Christianity even though I'm a Christian, so I'm going to go read the Bible or I'm going to go read C.S. Lewis or another theologian. Uh, the other obvious avenue is to go read a skeptic of Christianity, to go read Nietzsche or David Hume, um, and to see what they have to say. And funnily enough, we just read G.K. Chesterton, who started by reading skeptics. So how is one of those avenues more advisable than the other? Is there a point at which either becomes, sorry, I'm using healthy unhealthy language again. I don't know why I'm defaulting to that, but is there a point at which either becomes healthy or either becomes unhealthy? Excuse me.
Yeah, that's a question that I'm not sure you're going to get like a principled answer that applies to everyone in every circumstance, right? There's
Right.
going to be there's going to be a fair amount of like practical wisdom. That's Aristotle makes that distinction between like theory and practical wisdom or phronesis, where the individual circumstances will mean that you need to do different things.
Sure.
Um, I I don't in general advise a really fearful attitude towards skeptical arguments, right? So there's like some folks will think like, okay, the way to preserve yourself from skeptical crises is to never encounter a skeptical argument. I'm worried about that as a response, right? Because I think, oh no, there's for one thing, you're just going to hit one, and if you're totally unprepared, that's not great. And for another thing, I mean, Nietzsche is powerful, but he's not indomitable. He's not, he's not making an argument that no one could ever possibly refute. So I think sometimes it's healthy to have given it a try. We used to read a book in Tori called Nausea by Jean-Paul Sartre.
Mm.
And it was actually really helpful, I think, for our students to read because what it does is it gives a really like visceral experiential portrait of what the world would be like if there was no meaning maker, if there was no God who was kind of giving the world and any individual person's life a narrative that strung together the events in a meaningful way. And it's awful. Like it's actually it's viscerally, you feel nauseous reading this book, sort of imagining this experience that this man is having. um, I find that to be tremendously helpful in moments where I feel prone to skepticism, to remember like, oh, I'm toying with this as a way of living, but I'm not actually granting it the power of what it would actually look like to believe this all the way. Right. And so having been exposed to people like Sartre, I actually find to be helpful. Um, one of the things that I will say is I have been struck by how much a person's sort of sense of plausibility of the Christian story has way less to do with the explicit arguments for and against that they've encountered, and way more to do with the way that their imagination has been formed. So
Hmm.
if you've got an imagination that's been formed pretty much exclusively by a kind of a secular vision of the world, encountering a vision of the world where there's meaning and providence imbued in every sort of every experience, every atom. um, it starts to sound really implausible. And it just has nothing to do with the rational arguments at all. It just has to do with the kinds of stories that you consistently encounter. um, I think similarly, a vision of the world that maybe is more apt to right now as being just like interminably unjust. Right, where there's just like there's no possibility that this world's order could ever be seen as the product of a good God. So you get yourself more and more inside of that narrative of like and I don't want to say this in a way that says like there's no injustice in the world. Of course, there's tons of injustice in the world, but there's a way that you can get looped into a narrative that suddenly makes the Christian story very implausible, and makes the idea of being in a church and being a person who forgives with consistency, all of that starts to seem either implausible or unhealthy or things like that, because you've gotten looped into a narrative. And so I always ask when I've got a student who's really struggling with doubt, like, well, okay, what are you listening to, right? Like what TV shows are you watching? What books do you consistently go back and read?
Hmm.
Because what what's forming your imagination is going to significantly form your credulity. What you think of as like, oh yeah, that sounds right, that sounds like the way the world is, right? That's actually far more related to your imagination than it is to your reason. So I would
Hmm.
say if you're struggling, um, yeah, read some skeptics, read the Bible, pray a lot, but also be careful the stories that you're telling yourself, and be careful
Hmm.
the stories that you're kind of filling yourself with, because those are really going to matter.
Yeah, thank you. And we're almost out of time, so I just have one more question for you to follow up on that. If someone has uh, grown up in a circumstance where their imagination has been formed in a way such that it's hard for them to see a world in which there's providence in the everyday, how might they go about starting to explore that worldview and to like be able to see that?
Yeah, ooh, that's a multifaceted question. I do think, so the I mean the scriptures give us this beautiful vision. I would say the Psalms in particular. I grew up very secularized. I grew up in Canada. I went to a big public high school that was very sort of like the honor students were like almost exclusively atheists. And I was in a psalm session with Melissa Schubert Johnson, and we started talking about, I think it was Psalm 19, just the idea that if Jesus is the one who made the world, like every leaf, every twig, right? Like every atom in this world. I mean, we know that art reflects its maker, right? We know that that's the way that any piece of art is. It always reflects the person who makes it, which means that Jesus is literally everywhere, right? Like if the word was the one who created the world, you just can't get away from him. Every breath is an expression of his artistic creation, and that like really blew my mind. And thinking about that and kind of sitting in that made me realize how dead my vision of the natural world had been, how secular or how atheistic my vision of what nature meant had been, because I hadn't been thinking about it as being created in every single atom by Christ. So that was hugely helpful. But there, I mean, just read good Christians, right? Like not the sort of the thin Christian accounts, but the read Dostoevsky, right? Like, you know,
Mm,
read Pascal, read Kierkegaard, read Augustine, read Lewis, read Tolkien, right?
mm,
Read these Christians who have inhabited an imaginative world that is deeply Christian. And allow them to give you a vision, and read poetry, read Hopkins, right? Read John Donne.
mm.
Those are ways of populating your imagination with things that are good and true and real.
Great. Wow. Thank you so much. Well, we're out of time. If I know you've talked online a little bit more about skepticism, if people wanted to find that or more of your work just in general online, where could they go to do that?
Oh, good question. Google me, I think. I've done
Okay.
some titles for Biola. I don't, yeah. You've got my my page on the Biola faculty site has my publications. But yeah, just Google me, I think is probably the best thing I could say. I'm not good
Okay.
at self.
No, no. Thank you so much. No, I appreciate it. All right. Awesome. Well, thank you so much, Dr. Aijian.
Thanks.